Control is fleeting in the world of Deltarune. Unlike Undertale, where we have an abundance of control, deciding nearly all of Frisk's choices throughout the entire game, with the exceptions being very few and far between, we regularly lose control in Deltarune, having it literally ripped away from us several times. Though, when it comes to having control ripped away from oneself, there isn't an example more tragic than the main character of Deltarune themselves, Kris Dreamer. Kris is the prime example of both control and the lack thereof. Throughout the game, we control their actions as their soul, literally puppeteering them through worlds of light and dark alike. And at first, you think that you are Kris in this game, that you're controlling their actions because they're your actions. But then, you get to the end of the first chapter, and then the end of the second, and then the events of the third and fourth chapters, and it quickly dawns on you that, ultimately, you aren't Kris. Kris is still their own person, and no matter how many strings you attach to them, they can, and will, yank you away from them without any warning. This is what makes control so interesting. Despite the fact that we, as a soul, are inhabiting Kris's body and pulling them around like our subservient puppet, they can tear us out of them whenever they so please. We aren't taking control over them, we're being given control over them. Control that can be taken from us at any moment. With this knowledge, we can establish two separate entities that are fighting for control, which we will be titling the soul and the body. The soul, in this case, is us, the player. We are the soul that is regularly taking full control of almost every single action, with very few exceptions, like how Kris keeps their eyes closed when we try to look into Asriel's room in the Chapter 2 Dark World, or when they try to force us away from the bunker during the Chapter 3 minigames. The reason that they're able to do this is because, in this scenario, Kris represents the body. We can see Kris tear the soul out of them multiple different times, and even make their own independent actions with the soul inside of them. Because of this, we can conclude that ultimately, the body has more control over itself than the soul does. But if that's the case, then why does Kris always willingly take the soul back? We know that the soul is necessary for plot-related reasons, like sealing the fountains, but what about when they're living their normal lives, talking to Susie and Noelle, going to school? It's not like they can't operate at all without the soul. We even see Kris last for an extended amount of time in Chapter 4 without the soul, which shouldn't even be possible. Quite frankly, nothing about how Kris interacts with the soul should be possible. So something is going on here, and thankfully, we have a way to figure out what that is. We just have to expand our search a little bit. Rather than purely looking into Deltarune for answers, let's go back in time and talk about Undertale, where, believe it or not, we see something very similar happening with Asriel and Chara. The circumstances of what happened between these two characters are a bit different, but a lot of the same principles apply. And it's one of those few instances where we actually have something to reference, so just bear with me for a few minutes. First, let's do a quick recap of what these two did. After accidentally getting Asgore sick by putting buttercups in his pie, Chara hatched a plan to do something similar, to poison themselves using the same methods so that they would die. When this happened, Chara's soul lived on, because, as we know, human souls persist after the death of the body. And when this happened, their human soul was fused with Asriel's monster soul. This puts us in a similar position to what we see in Deltarune already, though it's worth noting that this is the case of soul fusion, which doesn't happen to Kris to our understanding. But I'll get into that a little bit later, don't worry. So, what happens when these two souls merge? Well, it gives Chara some control over Asriel's body. And since Asriel has the confidence of a wet doormat at this point in the story, and since human souls are stated to be more powerful than monster souls in Undertale, he gives Chara complete control over their actions. Piloting Asriel's body, Chara picked up their corpse and carried it to the village of the humans. And once the humans appeared and started to threaten Asriel, Chara wanted to unleash their power and kill everyone there. But Asriel didn't want to do that, and resisted their influence, reclaiming control over his own body. Asriel carried Chara's corpse back through the barrier to the underground. But after being attacked by the humans for so long, he wasn't able to last much longer, and ultimately turned to dust in the underground as he held onto Chara's body. what happens here actually follows the rules that we set out for how control works in Deltarune. The soul has a lot of control over the body, sure, but the body is able to make the final decisions and completely override what the soul wants to do. We see it happening with Kris, and now we've seen it happen with Asriel. In both cases, the body has been able to override the soul's wishes. But what if I told you that there was a third instance of this happening? An instance where, in order for our understanding of control in this series to work, we have to twist everything we thought we knew about Undertale on its head. It's time to talk about an absolute doozy. It's time to talk about Frisk, the main character that we play as throughout all of Undertale, and Chara. This already probably sounds insane, because nothing that I've said so far in this video seems to apply to Frisk at first glance. For the most part, if you played through the game, there would be little to no instances where Frisk does anything that we don't tell them to do. There's times where Frisk moves on their own, sure, but they'll always ultimately do what we want. The only real exceptions to this are all on the genocide route, where Frisk will start to take numerous actions that make them seem outright murderous, and get new lines of dialogue when interacting with objects relating to Chara's past. This is weird. We're in Frisk's body and we're using Frisk's soul to our understanding. So how is it that something can be taking control away from us like this? Well, that answer starts to become a bit more clear once we reach the end of the genocide route, after both Asgore and Flowey get killed by us, without us having any control over it. Once this happens, we finally come into contact with Chara, and their dialogue is interesting.
My human soul, my determination, they were not mine, but yours.
This is outright, direct confirmation that, in this instance, we are once again in control of the soul. This makes sense because, as we're told by the entries in the True Lab, determination is stored within the soul. But if this is the case, if we're the soul, and Chara is able to take full control over our actions, then that would mean that Chara is the body.
Thank you. Your power awakened me from death. At first, I was so confused. Our plan had failed, hadn't it? Why was I brought back to life? You. With your guidance, I realized the purpose of my reincarnation. Now we have reached the absolute. There is nothing left for us here. Let us erase this pointless world and move on to the next. No? How curious. You must have misunderstood. Since when were you the one in control?
And just like that, everything about Chara becomes entirely recontextualized. And this recontextualization kinda screws with everything that we know at first glance. How can we possibly be piloting Chara's body throughout Undertale, who we know died many years before the events of the game? Well, first, we have to talk about what happened to Chara's body after their plan with Asriel failed. We know that Asriel brought Chara's body back to the underground, because we can find Chara's coffin in the basement of New Home. And on the genocide route, Flowey describes to us what happened. Toriel carried Chara's body back to the ruins after she and Asgore had their falling out. We know that Flowey isn't just making this up, because at the end of a true pacifist route, you can check the coffin again and see mummy wrappings in there. Someone was buried in this coffin, and so it stands to reason that it was Chara, and that their body was eventually brought back to the bed of flowers in the ruins, just as it is described to us. However, if all of this is true, then there's a new problem. Chara's body really shouldn't exist anymore. After so many years have passed, their body should be completely decayed by now, right? How can we be piloting a body that should be nothing more than a pile of bones at this point? Well, that brings us back to the mummy wrappings that we can find inside of the coffin. I don't want this to turn into a history lesson about ancient Egypt, because that really doesn't have a place here, but I'll cover the bare basics of it. The entire point of mummification in ancient Egypt was to preserve the body, as it was thought to be an important step in ensuring the deceased could still use the body in the afterlife. I'm not going to go crazy in depth on religious beliefs and the like, because we would be here for way longer than I care to be for the sake of a silly little video game, but just know that preserving the body was the point of mummification, and it was actually incredibly effective when done right. The act of body preservation is still done to this day, and under the right conditions, a body can be preserved very well. But there's one change in particular that will happen to a body. The color of the skin. This starts happening almost immediately after death, and continues throughout the process of a body being preserved. And that color can vary from anywhere between dark brown or black to yellow. One deciding factor of this, according to some research that I've done, is melanin, the pigment that decides a person's skin color. If you were to look up an image of a mummy from ancient Egypt, you'd see dark browns and blacks as the primary skin colors, which makes sense, as the people who lived in ancient Egypt did have darker skin. They had a lot more melanin than, say, Chara, who is pale white. Additionally, for spiritual reasons, tar was added to the process to artificially darken the skin in ancient Egypt, but there would be no reason for this to happen to Chara. Their skin wouldn't turn the same color as the ones you'd see in ancient Egypt. It would become yellow, just like Frisk's. This is a massive point in favor of this theory. The fact that a dead body properly mummified would not only be preserved for lifetimes, but also have the color of their skin change to yellow in the case of Chara, would immediately give us an explanation as to how we can be piloting Chara's body throughout Undertale, while also explaining several different oddities throughout the game. At the start of the game, the armor that you have equipped is a bandage, a reference to the fact that their body was literally wrapped in bandages. It would also further solidify the point that literally every piece of armor in this game is associated with a dead human, with the exception of the Temmie armor. Because of course Temmie is the one exception to every rule. Back on the points of oddities that get explained under this train of thought, in Waterfall, when Undyne breaks the bridge and you fall down, you get a sudden replay of Chara's memories. Why would Frisk be getting a replay of Chara's memories if they are entirely their own person? There's undoubtedly a piece of Chara in play here, and it just so turns out that the piece of Chara here is literally the body we pilot. But most noteworthy of all is the fact that throughout the game, Flowey becomes more and more convinced that you are Chara, because you are. It is literally Chara's body that you are puppeteering throughout the entire game, and it's not until the very end of a true pacifist route that Asriel can tell that you're someone else entirely. This may have to do with the fact that the final person you save in the fight against Asriel is Chara, according to Toby himself during the Undertale 10 stream. The reason that he no longer feels Chara's presence around you could very well be due to the fact that we helped Chara's soul move on during that fight, and yet we are still there. So, what's all of this implying? Well, it's telling us that when Frisk fell, their body was broken, and they died. And somehow, their soul, persisting after death as we know human souls can, found its way to Chara's body, preserved and unbroken. This is what leads to the events of the game. It explains everything, except for control. Or, well, control during the non-genocide routes. We see Chara taking control and committing acts of violence in the genocide route time and time again. So, why does that never happen during the other routes? The answer is in stats.
HP, attack, defense, gold, EXP, LV. Every time a number increases, that feeling, that's me.
Throughout the genocide route, we frequently raise our LV. By increasing our level of violence by killing, it becomes easier to kill, easier to distance ourselves. As a result, by raising our LV, it becomes easier for Chara to take control back, as this coincides with what they want to do. By the end of Genocide, at LV 20, Chara takes full control and attacks both Asgore and Flowey without us ever getting so much as a chance to do anything else. There isn't even a spare button visible when we get into combat with Asgore. But on the pacifist route, we never raise our LV. And because of this, Chara completely lacks the power to kill. At least, that's what makes sense to me. And that establishes how control works in the world of Undertale, and how a human soul interacts with both a human body and a monster body. So, now that we've done that, let's see if we can go back and use the extra knowledge that we've gained from Undertale to solve what's happening with Kris in Deltarune. And first, we need to address the elephant in the room. I just went over an explanation as to why the skin color of Undertale's playable character is yellow, and how that is a significant piece of evidence for my theory. So, now we have to ask, does the same thing happen to Kris? Sometime before the events of Deltarune, did Kris die? There's simultaneously a lot and nothing to unpack here. Kris is still hard to read, and we only have guesses on what their motivations are. And no matter how confident we are in those guesses, well, how many of us were confident that Kris was the knight after Chapter 2? New information will always change how we view old information. Things like that are why people suddenly think that Gaster was green. Anyway, that's beside the point. Do we actually have anything to go off of here? Apart from the fact that Kris is literally referred to as a zombie more than once, and the fact that Kris seems to not have their soul anymore, and the fact that Kris is also wearing a bandage at the start of Deltarune, we do have one thing to talk about: body preservation. I touched on this earlier, but let's get into one of the more specific aspects of it: the environment. The area in which a body is stored is one of the most important things to consider when preserving a body, as you need to make sure that the body doesn't decompose. Preferably, you would need an area without insects or other animals, fairly low temperatures, borderline freezing to be exact, and low humidity, as moisture will lead to decomposition. And there's one area in Deltarune that we're pretty sure would have all of these aspects, and it's the one area that Kris seems to be deathly afraid of: the bunker. An underground bunker would very easily fit all three of these criteria. Nothing could get in, the temperature would be fairly chilly, and it would be low humidity. The temperature and humidity are also things that could be artificially changed if it were necessary, meaning the bunker that Kris seems to be so afraid of going into fits all of the criteria necessary. Another thing that we need to talk about when it comes to Kris is that they don't seem to bleed during the events of the game. Sure, there's a bloodstain on the floor in their room, but we literally see Kris jam their hand into their chest to pull out their soul, and there isn't a drop of blood on the floor or their hands. It's not like Toby Fox wasn't willing to put that in the game. We see Susie's hand bleeding in Chapter 4, so the only reason that Kris wouldn't be bleeding here is because they can't bleed here. There are two possible explanations as to why that is. Either their body went through the embalming process, which involves the blood being drained out of a dead body and replaced with embalming fluid, or all of their blood coagulated. I lean toward their blood being coagulated, because you can still see the red when they dig their hand into their chest, but it doesn't run and it doesn't stain anything, unlike what we see with Susie's blood in Chapter 4, dripping off of her hand and leaving a mark on Rousey's face. This would also explain why Susie says that Kris is bleeding during this scene in Chapter 4, but we don't see any blood anywhere. Kris has blood in their body, yes, but it's all coagulated, and it doesn't flow like regular blood does. And it's worth noting, the injury that Kris sustained here is from glass, the very thing that makes Susie bleed later on in this very chapter, and yet there's no kind of visible blood anywhere on Kris. And they tanked that glass when they fell here. Now, on the note of this scene at the end of Chapter 1, there's something that I think is interesting to bring up. The fact that Kris smiles. Kris is arguably the least happy person in this entire game. The only time we ever see them actually smile is usually when Susie does something to make them laugh, like failing to skip a rock. But in this scene, Kris has the most satisfied grin on their faces that we see across nearly every character in this entire franchise. Why is that? Well, I think it relates back to something I touched on earlier. LV. Now, technically, we don't know if Undertale LV and Deltarune LV are the same thing. But considering it's the same acronym in a game made by the same developer where a good chunk of the characters are the same, I'm inclined to believe that there's at least some level of similarity across the games when it comes to LV. At the start of Deltarune, Kris only has one LV, just like we do at the start of Undertale. But whenever a dark fountain is sealed, Kris gains one LV. I theorized earlier that LV might be an important factor in terms of control, that a body can gain control over its soul easier with bonus LV. And if that's the case, then the reason that Kris is smiling here might be because this is the first time they've ever been able to take control back over their own body. Kris is forced to keep this soul with them for plot-related reasons, and probably because they would die without it. We see Kris struggling to move around without the soul across these chapters. But one thing that I find really interesting is the fact that through chapters 1 and 4, Kris starts taking control over their body for longer and longer periods of time. It's only for one scene in chapter 1, for 2 scenes in chapter 2, none in chapter 3 because it's almost all exclusively in the Dark World, and for a long, long time in chapter 4, when their LV would be at its highest. If my theory is correct, then the amount of time that Kris has control over their own body will increase with every chapter. And considering we sealed multiple dark fountains in chapter 4, we might be looking at Kris having full control over themselves for a long, long time in chapter 5 and beyond. I wouldn't be surprised if, come the time of the festival, Kris tries to take full control over their body for the entire event, just for a chance to live. Before closing out this video, there's one more thing that I want to talk about when it comes to Kris: the prophecy. In chapter 1, Rouse tells us that the prophecy calls for a human, but when we get to chapter 4 and read the full prophecy, we learn that that's not the whole truth. It's not asking for a human, it's asking for a cage, one made up of human soul and parts, and it depicts a heart, the soul, contained by hands, a part of the body. Even Susie points out how weird this wording is. It feels like the prophecy is specifically trying to not call for a human here, just something like a human, like a dead human body being controlled by a human soul, perhaps. I don't know, I'm spitballing there, but I wanted to throw it out here because that wording is weird. And so, that is the theory. A theory about a power struggle between body and soul, and an explanation that explains several oddities in both Undertale and Deltarune, while simultaneously making it infinitely more complicated because we may or may not be playing as a walking corpse on puppet strings in both of these games. Thanks for watching. This is the first non-FNAF video I've ever posted on this channel, and I'd like to get the opportunity to do it more often. Talking about the same animatronics over and over gets tiring at a certain point. That said, this video might completely bomb because it's not appealing to my primary audience, who knows. But that's a worry for future me's bank account. For now, I'm gonna call it. Make sure you like, subscribe, and if you're on your phone, hit the hype button for me. And with that, I'm out of here. Take it easy.